For more on this and global water supply, I spoke to Robert McDonald, senior scientist at the Nature Conservancy. I asked him how serious this problem is.
It's a big problem. 1 in 4 cities have a shortage of water, and that's 400 million people. About 5% of global GDP is in cities that have water shortage of some kind.
So, for example, in San Diego, in California, they have a shortage of water. Drinking water is a part of it, but also because there's been a big drought in that area. How much of the water problems are related to people versus the weather or environment?
So what cities do is they put lots and lots of people in one spot. You're concentrating demand, and you're also concentrating economic power, political power, and so they're reaching out to get water to kind of overcome that concentration of demand. They often find a solution. They usually find a solution. Particularly for poor cities in the developing world, it's a big challenge. And those are the cities that are growing fastest right now.
Okay, so that's great. So we have 2 sets of problems. One for the big developed cities, and second is the developing countries. Let me start with the big cities like the New York, the Londons, and those type of cities. What's their greatest challenge, and what's the solution going to be?
For the ones that are growing fast, it's just keeping up with that demand. For the ones like New York or London that are growing a little slower, climate change is going to be a big issue for them. That supply is going to get less secure, and they have to think about, so climate change on average makes the wet season wetter and the dry season drier, so they have to figure out how do they get through that dry season. And you can see that in the cities in California, that snowpack isn't there, so in the dry season now they need some new way to store that water.
In developing countries, I'll bring up China as well. They obviously need and want clean water. They have a massive population that continues to grow. But the problems there aren't any different than anywhere else. They need clean drinking water, and they need to get it from point A to point B in a, I guess, most efficient way. What are their greatest issues?
One of the neat things about this global study was to see how different countries are at different points on that trajectory. So China's finishing or starting to really build its south to north water transfer project. And so you can view that as on the scale or even bigger than what we do in the US and Southern California. China's just starting to build that system. So I think the challenge is really similar. There's a lot of commonalities across countries. I worry more about cities like Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, that aren't going to have that money to bring water as far.
There has been activist investors in the past, like Jim Rogers, for example, in Singapore, who have talked about investing in the water. There'd be a water shortage, and therefore investors need to look at it as a commodity, like a business almost. Do you think that is ultimately good for the water industry to look at it as a business, or is it a government responsibility to provide sort of a basic need for its citizens?
I think governments have a responsibility to provide water, and in almost every city globally, it's ultimately that government that's trying to make sure the water's there. There's a role for private companies in being that water provider, in building those canals, in building the desalination plant, but ultimately it's a public good. And so one of the reasons governments often step in is to make sure that poor communities have access to water, for example, in a way that they might not have to if they had to pay for that full access to water.
You mentioned earlier climate change and the impact that has on the industry. The Global Congress is happening later on here in Mexico City. And climate change is going to be a huge topic. If you were to tell those legislators around the world one thing they can do to help sort of climate change as it relates to water, what would that be?
Oh, can I give you 2? I don't know.
Sure,
one is avoiding big emissions of greenhouse gas and avoiding catastrophic climate change, preventing us going too far down that path. But the climate's already changing, and they have to plan for that. So that's message 2 is many cities have not yet thought about what does climate change mean for their water supply, what does sea level rise mean. So that has to be on the agenda of every urban plan from now going forward.